The champagne flutes were a forest of glittering crystal. The string quartet was playing Vivaldi, and the air in our sprawling penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and self-congratulation. It was our 20th anniversary party, a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to celebrate 2 decades of our perfect marriage. But I knew it wasn't about us. It was about him. My husband, David, had just closed the biggest deal of his career, a multi-billion-dollar merger that had made him the undisputed king of the tech world. Tonight was his coronation, and I, as always, was just part of the royal scenery. He stood in the center of the room, a circle of admirers hanging on his every word. He looked magnificent in his custom-tailored suit, his face flushed with victory and vintage champagne. He was a god in his own universe, and this party was his temple. I watched from the edge of the room, a ghost in a designer dress, my smile, as practiced and perfect as the floral arrangements. Later, he gathered everyone for a toast. He raised his glass, his eyes sweeping the room, deliberately passing over me. He spoke of ambition, of vision, of the relentless drive required to build an empire. He thanked his board, his partners, and his legal team. It was a brilliant, charismatic speech. He didn't mention my name once. After the applause died down and the guests began to mingle again, he walked over to me, his eyes shining with a cold, cruel light I knew all too well. He cornered me near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering city skyline, a backdrop for the execution he was about to perform. "Well, Ellie," he said, his voice a low, contemptuous drawl. 20 years, quite a run, wouldn't you say? "It's been a life, David," I replied, my voice even. He let out a short, ugly laugh. "A life? For you, maybe? For me, it's been a prelude. A very long, very boring prelude to the life I'm actually supposed to be living." He took a deliberate step closer, invading my space, his voice dropping to a hiss meant only for me. "This deal, it changes everything. I'm on a different level now. I need a partner who can keep up, not a homemaker who organizes my sock drawer." The words were designed to be a killing blow, a final, brutal dismissal of my entire existence. He was casting me aside in the middle of a party celebrating our life together, like a piece of outdated software. He must have seen the flicker of something in my eyes, and he mistook it for pain. It emboldened him. "I'm starting my life over." "Ellie," he declared, his voice rising with the thrill of his own cruelty. "I need to be with someone who understands my world, someone who is my equal. You've served your purpose. You've raised the kids, you've run the house, you've been wonderful. Manager, but I'm done. I'm done with this quiet, domestic little life. I'm done with you." He stood back, a triumphant smirk on his face, waiting for the tears, for the scene, for the satisfying collapse of the woman he had just rendered obsolete. But I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just took a delicate sip of my champagne, met his furious, confused gaze over the rim of the glass, and smiled. My smile was the one thing he had never been able to control, and it unnerved him completely. The triumphant smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had just detonated a bomb in the middle of our life, and I was looking at him as if I was merely admiring the fireworks. "What's so funny?" he demanded, his voice losing its sharp edge. "Nothing's funny, David," I said, my voice still calm, but with an underlying current of something he hadn't heard in 2 decades. Authority. "I'm just agreeing with you. You're absolutely right. It is time for you to start your life over." My agreement was a move he hadn't anticipated. He was prepared for a fight, for tears, for begging. He wasn't prepared for a cheerful consensus. It threw him off balance. "So that's it," he stammered. 20 years and you just agree?" "Of course," I said. "You've built your empire. You've become the man you always wanted to be. You deserve a partner who reflects that. I completely understand." He stared at me, his mind, so brilliant at navigating the complex world of corporate takeovers, completely unable to process this simple, domestic negotiation. He had spent 20 years seeing me as a soft, predictable variable in his life's equation. He had no idea that I was the one who had written the algorithm. Have you ever been so underestimated that it becomes a superpower? For 20 years, I was Ellie, the quiet, supportive wife, the homemaker. It was the most effective camouflage in the world. He never once saw the woman I had been before him, the woman who had designed the very foundations of the empire he now claimed as his own. "You see, David," I continued, setting my champagne flute down on a passing tray, You're a magnificent frontman. You have the charm, the ambition, the ruthlessness. You can sell a vision like no one else. But you've always been terrible with the details, the back end, the code. A new kind of fear, a fear he wasn't familiar with, began to creep into his eyes. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Project Chimera, I said, using the name of the revolutionary software that had been the foundation of his first company, the one he had built into this billion-dollar behemoth. Our little project back in that tiny garage apartment, the one you said would change the world. I built that company from the ground up, he hissed, his confidence returning as he stood on what he thought was solid ground. You did, I agreed. You were the one who secured the funding, who made the deals. But who wrote the code, David? Who spent 2 years sleeping on a cot, fueled by coffee and sheer will, architecting the most complex and elegant piece of software the industry had ever seen? Who designed the system with a proprietary backdoor, a kill switch that only the original architect would know about? The color drained from his face. The confident CEO, the master of the universe, was gone. In his place was the scared and secure young man I remembered from 2 decades ago, the one who could sell a dream but had no idea how to actually build it. That's impossible, he whispered. That code was obsolete years ago. The original code was, I confirmed. But the architectural principles, the foundational logic, the hidden backdoors. A good architect always leaves a way back into her own building. You've built a magnificent skyscraper on top of it, David, but the foundation, the master key to the whole system, has always been mine. He stared at me, his mind frantically trying to process the implications. He had just ended our marriage. He had just declared me obsolete, and in doing so, he had just handed me the motive and the opportunity to burn his entire world to the ground. The aftermath of the party was a quiet Cold War. David, shaken but still arrogant, assumed my words were an empty threat. The bitter ramblings of a woman scorned. He had his lawyers draw up a divorce settlement that was both insulting and cruel. He offered me the house, a generous alimony, and a non-disclosure agreement that would effectively erase me from his corporate history. He thought he was being magnanimous. He was actually handing me a declaration of war I refused to sign. I moved into the guest room, a silent, watchful presence in my own home. He saw a heartbroken woman clinging to the wreckage of her marriage. He had no idea I was a general, surveying the battlefield from a high vantage point, preparing my assault. Wow. He was busy celebrating his merger and being feted by the financial press. I went back to work. My first call was to a man named Ben Carter, my old partner from the early days, a brilliant but unassuming programmer whom David had fired years ago for not being a team player. Ben had been my co-architect on Project Chimera. He was the only other person on Earth who knew the system's secrets. I met him in a small, anonymous coffee shop. He was older now, a quiet, unassuming man who ran a small cybersecurity firm. When I told him what had happened, a slow, grim smile spread across his face. I've been waiting for this call for 15 years, Ellie, he said. For 2 weeks, we worked out of his small office, a digital war room, while David was busy with his lawyers, trying to legally force me out of his life. I was busy reacquainting myself with the digital ghost in his machine. The backdoor I had built into the original code was an elegant, beautiful thing, a master key that could bypass decades of security upgrades and patches. It was a whisper in the system's DNA, a secret only its creator would know. There's a unique intimacy to dissecting a system you created. It's like revisiting that part of your own mind, a younger, fiercer version of yourself. Every line of code was a memory, every algorithm a piece of my soul I had poured into this project. David had taken the credit, the money, the fame, but he had never owned the art. The art was still mine. And as I delved deeper into the company's servers, I found that the foundation wasn't just my old work, it was rotten. David, in his arrogance, had built his empire on a series of reckless, fraudulent shortcuts. He had cooked the books, inflated user numbers, and hidden massive liabilities in a web of shell corporations. His new multi-billion-dollar merger wasn't a triumph. It was a desperate attempt to use a massive infusion of new cash to cover up the fact that his entire company was a house of cards. On the verge of collapse, the man who had just bought into this empire, a ruthless legendary investor named Alistair Finch, was known for 2 things: his genius at spotting winners and his absolute merciless destruction of anyone who tried to cheat him, I had found my weapon. It wasn't the back door. It was the truth. I had Ben compile everything into a single encrypted file. The original Chimera code, the proof of my architectural ownership, and the irrefutable evidence of David's years of fraud. Then I made my second call. I didn't call the SEC. I didn't call the press. I called Alistair Finch's office and requested a meeting, telling his assistant it was regarding a critical vulnerability in his new acquisition. The meeting was set for the following week at his corporate headquarters. The day before, David, his patience finally exhausted, served me with eviction papers. He was throwing me out of the house we had shared for 20 years. He left a small, handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It's time to go, Ellie. Your part in this story is over. I packed a small overnight bag. As I walked out of the penthouse for the last time, I looked at the life I had built and then willingly given away. I felt a pang of sadness, not for the life I was losing, but for the young woman I had been, the one who had believed that love meant sacrificing her own dreams. I left my own note for David on the hall table. It was a single printed sheet. It was the time and address of my meeting with Alistair Finch. The boardroom at Finch Capital was a temple of minimalist power. It was a glass box, suspended 50 floors above the city, with a single, massive oak table that felt like an altar to capitalism. Alistair Finch sat at the head of it, a man in his late 60s with the cold, still eyes of a predator. He was flanked by a team of stone-faced lawyers. He had expected a nervous whistleblower. He was not expecting me. I walked in, not as a desperate homemaker, but as the woman I had been before David, a confident, focused architect of complex systems. I didn't say a word. I simply placed a tablet on the table and played a presentation dot it. Started with the elegant, flowing code of Project Chimera with my original timestamp design documents. Then it moved to David's fraudulent accounting, the inflated numbers, the hidden debts. It was a calm, clinical, and utterly devastating demolition of his entire empire. I showed Finch, with undeniable proof, that he hadn't just bought a company. He had bought a multi-billion-dollar lie, and that the homemaker, his new star CEO, was in the process of divorcing, was the only person on earth who held the keys to the kingdom. When the presentation was over, the room was silent. Finch stared at the screen, then at me. His cold eyes were unreadable. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice a low rumble. "I want what's mine," I said simply. "I am the original architect of this company's core technology. David is a fraud who has been cooking the books for a decade. You have two choices. You can let this company collapse in a public, humiliating scandal that will decimate your investment and your reputation. Or you can partner with me. We void the merger on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. We oust David. You help me take control of the board, and I, as the only person who truly understands the system's architecture, will salvage the technology, rebuild the company from the ground up, and protect your investment." It was the biggest gamble of my life. I was facing a man who could crush me without a second thought, but I had learned from the best. I had spent 2 decades watching men like him, learning their language, understanding their motivations. They don't respect sentiment, they respect leverage. And I had just put a gun to the head of his billion-dollar baby. Finch was silent for a full minute. He looked at his lawyers who were whispering frantically. Then he looked back at me. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. "Call an emergency board meeting," he said to his assistant. "It seems Mr. Sterling has some explaining to do." The emergency board meeting was held the next day. David walked in, confident and dismissive, expecting to deal with a minor legal challenge from his estranged wife. He saw me sitting at the far end of the long boardroom table and gave me a look of pure, contemptuous pity. Then, Alistair Finch walked in and sat down, not next to David, but next to me. The color drained from David's face. "Good morning, gentlemen," Finch began, his voice a blade of ice. "It has come to my attention that we have a significant problem with our recent acquisition. It seems the company we purchased is not the company that was advertised. But luckily for us, the original architect of the company's real value is here. With us today, I'd like to introduce you all to the new controlling partner, an incoming CEO of the company formerly known as Sterling Systems. Her name is Eleanor Vance. I stood up and looked down the long table at the man I had once loved, the man who had dismissed me as a simple homemaker. His face was a grotesque mask of disbelief and utter ruin. He was staring at me as if I were a ghost, the ghost of a woman he thought he had erased 20 years ago. "Hello, David," I said, my voice clear and steady. It seems my part in the story wasn't quite over after all. The fallout was swift and brutal. Faced with irrefutable proof of fraud, David was fired by the board he had once commanded. He was left with nothing. The prenuptial agreement he had forced on me 20 years ago, the one designed to protect his assets, now protected mine. He was a king without a kingdom, a man whose entire identity had been stripped away in a single devastating boardroom coup. I didn't watch him fall. I was too busy rebuilding. The company was a mess, but the core technology, my technology, was still brilliant. With Finch's backing and Ben Carter back by my side as my head of engineering, we began the long, arduous process of cutting out the rod and salvaging the foundation. I didn't move back into the penthouse. I sold it, along with all the trappings of the life I had shared with David. I bought a small, quiet house with a garden. I had spent 20 years managing a home for someone else. Now, I wanted to build one for myself. About a year later, I was at a tech conference, preparing to unveil the new, revitalized company. As I walked through the crowded hall, I saw him, David. He was working as a low-level consultant for a small, struggling startup. He was wearing an ill-fitting suit, and the confident, charismatic swagger was gone, replaced by the weary, haunted look of a man who had lost everything. Our eyes met across the crowded room. There was no anger in his gaze, no hatred, just a profound, hollowed-out sense of defeat. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a final silent acknowledgement of the game he had played and lost. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. I walked up to the stage, not as a wife, not as a homemaker, but as the CEO of my own company, my company, the one I had built, lost, and reclaimed. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the bright lights, at the future I was finally building on my own terms. My husband had been right about one thing. It was time for me to start my life over. He just never imagined I'd be starting it from the throne of his ruined empire.